Welcome to another episode of Mike's Money Picks. Today on the podcast, we're going to be breaking down the Friday, January 19th slate of college basketball DFS on DraftKings. We've got a nice little four-game slate that's a decent mix of mid-majors as well as power conference teams. And so this one has got a lot to break down, a lot of different players. And four games that are really all about equally intriguing. According to KenPom, the game totals on these games are all within 6 points of each other. So four game environments with, kind of similar totals, a lot of different play styles though. So this one's going to be fun to break down. Got a lot of information to get you guys so you can get the best plays for this Friday night slate. Now, if you are used to me doing the Saturday slate, I'm not going to be able to do the Saturday slate this week. I am actually heading out of town. I'm driving up to Dayton, Ohio tomorrow. I've mentioned here on the show before, but my dad is a graduate of the University of Dayton. So we are going to watch the Dayton, Rhode Island game on Saturday. And so I will pretty much be in a car for Friday afternoon as well as Saturday afternoon. So I'm not going to have a show for the Saturday or the Sunday slate. So if you want my full thoughts on that slate, I am going to be chatting in the Fantasy Corner Discord. Hopefully I will be able to post my game notes in there as well. So link is in the description. It's in the description for the audio feed as well. But if you want my full thoughts for the Saturday slate, join the Fantasy Discord. Come on, hop in there and talk to a lot of different people who have had a lot of success playing college basketball at the DFS lately. Like we've had members of the Discord take down the Dime Time, the Quarter Jukebox, the High Five. Somebody almost took down the 33 single entry this week. So a lot of smart people in there. You can get my information as well as other people in there. If you join it, like I said, that's going to be the only way you're going to get my thoughts on the Saturday or the Sunday slate. All right, so little four-game slate on Friday. You got a lot to break down. I think we covered everything we need to in the introduction. Let's go ahead and get down to it. Let's go ahead and start off with game number one, Georgetown taking on Xavier. All right, so game number one is the battle in the Big East between Georgetown and Xavier. This one I would consider probably the most likely game on the slate to turn into a blowout. Like I mentioned, all four of these games have similar point totals, but the spreads in them and the styles of play in them are kind of what sets them apart. This one, I think, could very well end in a blowout. KenPom has this one projected to be 83-66 in favor of the Xavier Musketeers, giving Xavier the highest team total of the slate. And look, it's just because Georgetown isn't all that good, and Xavier is a good offensive team, and they like to get up and down. Georgetown ranks 264th in the nation in tempo and 274th in defense, so they're just not providing a whole lot of resistance to teams that are, coming in and trying to score points on them. Now, there are some guys on Georgetown that are targetable, though. Jaden Epps is the first one. He has a 29% usage rate on the season, but it's been over 30% in each of his last two games and put up 45 and 27 fantasy points in each of those last two games. So he has shown the ability to score a lot of fantasy points and to provide value, even if Georgetown gets beat, even if they don't score a whole lot of points as a team. Jaden Epps has shown the ability to get there on his own. He's probably just on paper in general, the best play from this Georgetown side. However, he's not the only guy that is going to be in my player pool, though. We've seen bigs have a lot of success against this Xavier team, including Jalen Thomas of Butler on, I believe it was Wednesday night. If not Wednesday, it was Tuesday, but it was Xavier and Butler when they played this week. Jalen Thomas had a really good game at the center position. And so Supreme Cook would be that guy that could do that for Georgetown. He had a 31% usage rate in his last game against UConn, had 38 fantasy points, and UConn is generally a pretty tough matchup for bigs. So I think Supreme Cook could definitely get there. It would not shock me if he did. And then one thing that you do need to monitor for this Georgetown team is in recent games, Jay Heath has significantly outplayed and seen more minutes than Rowan Brumbaugh. And so if Jay Heath is going to continually get 30 minutes a game like he's got in the last two games, he could be a solid option. However, he's definitely limited because his usage rate isn't the highest. He doesn't get the most shots in the world, and he doesn't do a whole lot outside of shooting, but he's put up 19 and 21 fantasy points in each of the last two games. That's a solid 4x value for his current salary. So that's a guy that might make it to my player pool, but not purely, not like totally sold on him. Now, on the Xavier side, this is the highest projected scoring team on the slate, so it would be wise to play a few Xavier guys. Their top two guys are Quincy Oliveri and Desmond Claude. And I'm going to be honest, it is Claude over Oliveri for me. Claude almost always has better peripheral stats than Oliveri. And in the last few games, in 3 of the last 4 games to be exact, Desmond Claude has gotten more shot attempts than Oliveri. Now, has he always made more than Oliveri? No, but if he's getting more shots and he's putting up more peripheral stats, then there's just more opportunities for Desmond Claude to put up more fantasy points than Quincy Oliveri. And he's $400 cheaper on DraftKings. So not saying that Quincy Oliveri is a bad play. But between the two of them, I would much prefer to play Desmond Claude. He will be in much more of my lineups than Oliveri. Now, the big situation for Xavier has gotten interesting. Grant Namiksha has moved into the starting power forward role. I guess I would say he's the power forward. And he's been pretty solid. In his last 3 games, you've seen his minutes go up 22, 28, and 33. Those are the 3 games that he's really been a big part of the Xavier offense. And he's put up 19, 19, and 28 fantasy points in those 3 games. And at only $5,800 in a game where Xavier's likely to score 83 points, I think he's a solid option. Abu Usman would be another one that I would consider. He's gotten a price up from the last few times we've seen him. But again, he's got that starting center role for a team that is going to score 80 plus points. And Georgetown is not a good rebounding team. So Namiksha and Usman would definitely be 2 guys that I would consider. The other guy that starts for them is Davion McKnight, and he had a really solid game against Butler. 7 for 12 from the field, 25 fantasy points. He just hasn't really been all that consistent. Like the ceiling has been there, but the consistency hasn't. I think he's an okay GPP play. And then for Xavier's bench, Trey Green and Daywin Swain are 2 guys that would probably play a ton of minutes if there was a blowout, and they would probably be pretty good in terms of usage if there was a blowout. So I think they're guys that, if you're fully banking on a Xavier blowout of Georgetown, they're guys that would have to make your player pool. And they're 2 guys that could be the difference in a GPP in terms of value plays if Xavier does in fact get the blowout. But again, if they don't get the blowout, those guys haven't really shown a whole lot of minutes in usage in close games. So that would kind of be like the if and only if situation. All right, game number 2 is going to be a battle in the A10 between St. Louis and VCU. And honestly, I kind of wish that they used these A10 teams on the main slate more. Like the A10 West Coast Conference, Mountain West, get these good mid-major conferences on the slates more often, DraftKings, because they've got a lot of really interesting teams in these conferences, a lot of really good players. And I'd be okay if there was just every night there was a power conference slate and a mid-major slate, but maybe that's just me. I personally enjoy watching mid-major college basketball. So anyway, this one is projected to be 78 to 69 in favor of VCU. Now, these are 2 kind of difficult teams to project. So on the St. Louis side, their recent starting 5 has been Medley, Larry Hughes II, Gibson Jemerson, Terrence Hargrove, and then Bradley Ezewiro at the center position. So the rotation, though, has been super inconsistent. Those 5 guys aren't necessarily their 5 highest minute players. So the one thing that I do want to point out, though, is Larry Hughes is kind of the 3K mid-major misprice that you get every now and then from DraftKings. He's not a super duper productive player. He's not a super consistent player, but he's a starter. He's going to play double-digit minutes, and he's only $3,000 on DraftKings. And if you look at his game log, 3 of his last 4 games, he's been over 17 fantasy points. So, he kind of had a dud against Dayton, but I'm kind of willing to forgive that, and I'm kind of willing to roll him out at only 3K, and I wonder if the rest of the slate is going to catch that. Now, out of that starting 5, Ezewiro is a 2-time transfer. He came from Georgetown most recently, so he didn't get to start playing until December. And in that game against Dayton, I actually watched that game because, I'm going to see Dayton on Saturday. I got to know all these guys, right? And so I watched that game against Dayton, and Dayton center Deron Holmes just absolutely ate his lunch. He was no match inside for Holmes. I think that it kind of contributed to him playing a little bit lower minutes, but I'm willing to go back to him against VCU because VCU does not have a big man like Deron Holmes. Terrence Hargrove is kind of like a small ball 4, kind of like maybe like a Zach Randolph, I guess, if I could compare him to anybody. His production has gone down ever since Ezewiro came into the lineup, so it's kind of hard to get behind him. Gibson Jemerson is the one with the most consistent minutes, most consistent shot attempts, most consistent usage. The only downside is he doesn't give you a whole lot outside of scoring. He is pretty shot dependent. However, if he's going to be shot dependent, at least he gets a lot of shots. 38 and 26 fantasy points in his last 2 games. It's not a terrible spot for Jemerson. Now, the other 2 starters, or other 1 starter, Cian Medley, I guess, doesn't play a lot of minutes, but he is the point guard. He's only $4,000. Just not a really consistent option. When I watched the game against Dayton, I was more impressed by their backup guards. Michael Meadows played a decent amount of minutes in the Dayton game, 28 minutes, 18 fantasy points. He was the guy that impressed me out of all their guards. He would be the one that just off the eye test I would be more likely to play. And then Sincere Parker, He is not really consistent at all. You look at his last 4 games, it's 32, 41, 0, and 19. I don't know what he did to get in the coach's doghouse against St. Joe's, but other than that, he's been pretty consistently good, and he has a massive usage rate. So, maybe he would be a guy that you would consider. I guess if I had to speculate, he was returning from injury in that St. Joe's game. So maybe that contributed to him only playing 3 minutes and then, ramping it up to 16 against Dayton. So if he does get a full minute load against VCU, that would tend to bode well for him having a pretty good day because he has a massive usage rate. Now on the VCU side, they're a little bit easier to figure out, but they have kind of shifted what their team has been. Zeb Jackson, if you look at KenPom, is their usage leader on the season. He's scored a lot of fantasy points over the course of this season, right? But he has not been above 23 fantasy points in VCU's last 6 games, and there's a direct reason for that, and that reason is Sean Bairstow. Sean Bairstow has kind of been their best player over the last 6 games. And he has seen the highest usage rate in the last 6 games. Max Shulga, the point guard, has been second in usage rate in those last 6 games. Max Shulga has actually been more productive from a fantasy perspective in those last 6 games, though, because Max Shulga will absolutely fill up the peripheral stats of rebounds and assists and steals. So if I were to play anybody on this VCU team in that order, it would probably be Shulga and then Bairstow, and I would probably cross Jackson off my list until he gets his price adjusted for what his current role is. And also right now, Shulga and Bairstow are the only 2 playing consistently over 30 minutes. Jackson's actually been third on the team in minutes, but he really hasn't been super duper consistent. Now, we just mentioned that St. Louis-Dayton game. Well, if St. Louis is a weak defensive team on the interior, if Deron Holmes can go off against him, well, who can go off for VCU? Well, Fermin is their starting center. He is not Deron Holmes, though, from a scoring perspective. So he might be a guy to consider, but I don't think you can expect like a 50 fantasy point performance like Deron Holmes gave. And then Kawani is their starting power forward. Hasn't really had any ceiling games recently, but, again, if you think that might be the matchup to attack St. Louis on the interior, those would be the 2 guys you would want to target. And then Joe Bamasil is an Oklahoma transfer who has been pretty up and down, but if you get him on the up, you got a really high ceiling. The only downside is he's done most of his work in blowout games, so if you think VCU gets up in this one, they give a little more run for Bamasil, that would be a guy that you could go to because his usage rate in his minutes has been massive. On to game number 3, the Big Ten battle for Friday night. That is Indiana taking on Wisconsin. KenPom has it projected to be Wisconsin 79-66. On the Indiana side, they're going to be a tough team to target with that projected total at only 66 points. But one thing that I think is worth noting for them is that Mackenzie Mbako, super talented freshman, he's seeing his usage rate increase and increase and increase as the season goes on. His last 3 games, he's taken double-digit shots in each game, 24, 29, and 17 fantasy points in those 3 games. I think he's got to be in play just because if that trend continues, he's eventually going to outpace that salary of $5,700. Now, Xavier Johnson is kind of the big question mark for Indiana. He was injured and they played without him for a while and they were playing pretty well. And then he came back and he had one really big game against Oklahoma, one dud against Rutgers, and now he's coming off the bench in his last 2 games against Minnesota and Purdue. I don't know what's going on with that situation. I really don't, but Xavier Johnson at the start of the season was their starting point guard. He was a high usage player. He was a high quality player for Indiana. And if he eventually gets back to where he was, then he's a solid play, but I just don't know if you can count on him at all. I think in GPPs, I'm willing to take a shot at him. I've mentioned in the past that I am a 20 max player. I'm willing to put him in one of my 20 lineups and just hope that he goes off. But I really, there's nothing in the last 2 games that would indicate that he is eager to go off. In Johnson's kind of, downfall has been Trey Galloway's rise. In his last 2 games, 33 and 32 fantasy points, he has been running the point with Xavier Johnson's minutes being down and Xavier Johnson coming off the bench. Even with them only projected to score 66 points, I think Galloway is in play for me because of that increased role that he has had. And if I play Galloway in a lineup, I'm certainly not playing Johnson in the same lineup. Another thing to consider, Wisconsin on the interior is pretty stout, but Indiana does run their team through Khalil Ware and Malik Renew. Don't get that twisted. This is not Galloway or Mbako's team. This is a Ware and Renew team. They're the 2 guys that are going to have the highest usage and get a lot of shots on the interior. But I just think it's a pretty tough matchup, and they've shown the ability that they'll get in foul trouble as well. So they're not super high on my list. There's other guys in that price range that I would rather play, but I did just want to get it out there that those are 2 guys who do have a legitimately high usage rate. Now, on the Wisconsin side, they have kind of shrunk their rotation down just a little bit. They have four guys, and exactly four guys, who are going to play 30 plus minutes, and then the other spot is going to be a rotation, and the other guys are going to fill in for the remaining minutes. And those four guys are Stephen Crowell, AJ Storr, Tyler Wall, and Chucky Hepburn. Stephen Crowell and Tyler Wall are the two bigs for Wisconsin. We've talked about all season how Indiana has been a tough matchup for bigs. Well, Zach Edey kind of flipped that on his head when he went off on Indiana Tuesday night. So I kind of don't know what to do with that, whether to just, completely reverse course and say, oh, Indiana is a good matchup for bigs, or just say that, it's Zach Edey and he does that to everybody. So on paper, Crowell and Wall do have a tough matchup, but maybe it's not so tough after all. AJ Storr is a guy that we got to talk about, though. He is Wisconsin's leader in usage. He is significantly their leader in shots, but the story has not changed with AJ Storr. My biggest gripe on him is that he doesn't do a whole lot for you outside of scoring, and so that limits his ceiling, and it means that for him to have a ceiling night, it's going to have to come on a night where he scores like 25 points. And so I just think there's a very narrow path for AJ Storr. And I'm not saying that I'm going to just X him out entirely, but there's other guys that to me have more easier paths to ceiling nights than he does because of how he gets his fantasy points. Now, Chucky Hepburn is, kind of their starting point guard, but he's been kind of a non-factor offensively for them in the last two games. He's attempted 3 shots and then 4 shots in their last 2 games. He had decent fantasy numbers in that second to last game against Northwestern, but it was because of the rebounds, assists, and steals that he piled up. I know he's going to play a lot of minutes, but there's just nothing really heading in the right direction for Chucky Hepburn that would make me want to play. Last game of the night is going to be the battle in the Mountain West between UNLV and Colorado State. KenPom has this game projected to be Colorado State 78-70. UNLV is a team who has kind of flipped their starting lineup upside down from when it started the season. But in the recent weeks, their starting lineup has been the Boone brothers, Caleb and Keelan, as their 2 bigs. And then Dedan Thomas as the point guard. And then Luis Rodriguez and Justin Webster as the other 2 guards, or kind of the wings, I guess. And really after that, Whaley and Johnson are the only 2 that are really going to see minutes off the bench. Isaiah Cottrell is questionable for this game. I would expect him to play a bit role if he were, in fact, active for this game. So they're kind of playing a short rotation, and they've kind of been fairly predictable with where the minutes go. Where the usage goes is where it gets interesting, though. The usage numbers for Caleb Boone are really good. He has a really high usage rate. He has a really high rebound rate, and he gets a lot of blocks and a lot of steals. So he has a massive ceiling. Just in the last 3 games, he's had a 41-point outing and a 36-point outing. However, he is super prone to foul trouble. He only had 16 fantasy points in his last game against Boise State, only played 19 minutes because he could not stay out of foul trouble. He fouled out of that game. So if Caleb Boone is able to stay out of foul trouble, he's got as big a ceiling as any forward on this slate, and his price tag is only $6,800. The problem is, can he stay out of foul trouble? Well, in this game against Colorado State is not a team that really runs a whole lot through their bigs. So by comparison's sake, I think this is a team that he shouldn't end up in foul trouble, or it's not very likely that he ends up in foul trouble, but it wouldn't shock me if he does. I've seen crazier things happen. Keelan Boone is his little brother, and he's playing a lot of minutes. His usage rate is not as high. He does not do as much without the basketball that Caleb does. I would absolutely prefer to play Caleb than Keelan. Make sure you click the right one if you are playing one of the Boones. Also, I really do like Luis Rodriguez. He's kind of been their most consistent player in conference play. He gets double-digit shots pretty much every night, and he's going to put up probably 30 fantasy points every night. It's what he's done for the last 5 games. And he's a guy that, like I said, he's going to get you his shots. He can also fill it up with rebounds and every now and then get you some steals. In an up-tempo game against Colorado State, I do think Luis Rodriguez is a guy who does have a lot of potential. I just wish he was a little cheaper. I would be much more willing to play him if he were like $7,400 than sitting there at $8,000. Now, on the Colorado State side, we have talked about them a few times. They've been on a few DraftKings slates, and they have shortened up their rotation significantly. A lot of these randoms that we're advocating for as value plays earlier in the season, and I probably shouldn't call them randoms. Like if you're a Division I basketball player, you're a good college basketball player, but for the context of DFS, they're kind of randoms. They're not guys that we can play anymore. They've really shortened up their rotation. Their starting lineup recently has been Isaiah Stevens, Josiah Strong, Neat Clifford, Patrick Cartier, and Joel Scott, and they've really given those 5 guys a lot of minutes. Jordan Lake Jalen Lake and Joe Palmer have been the only real two guys that have been significant contributors off the bench recently for Colorado State. So I would keep my player pool for Colorado State just to those 7 guys. And what tends to happen with Colorado State in conference play, this is what happens generally every game. Isaiah Stevens plays a ton of minutes, gets a ton of assists, has a ton of usage, and gets you between 33 and 42 fantasy points. After that, one of the bigs, Scott and Cartier, tends to go off. In fact, if you look at these 2 bigs for Colorado State and you go look at their game logs, exactly one of them, no more than one of them, has scored 23 fantasy points or more in 4 of their last 5 games. So if you're going to play guys from Colorado State, don't play Scott and Cartier together. Play one of them because one of them's going to go off. It's pretty likely that one of them's going to go off. But Nate Clifford is actually a guy I'm really interested in. He is their second leader in usage in conference play behind Isaiah Stevens, and he's been a pretty solid contributor. He will get a lot of boards. He averages 6 rebounds a game. He's taken double-digit shots in 2 of his last 3. He's a guy that has a pretty high ceiling in what I would consider to be a game where Colorado State, we let me rephrase that. I got started with a sentence there and didn't know how to finish it. They're projected 78 points. And so if they're projected 78 points, it would stand the reason that Isaiah Stevens, as well as one other player, is going to hit value. So my nominee for most likely to do that would be Nate Clifford. Now, after that, what I do think is worth monitoring is Lake and Palmer off the bench. So Palmer was a starter at the start of the season for this Colorado State team. Didn't really play a ton of minutes, but he was a starter, and now he's like kind of ramping back up. He played 26 minutes against Air Force and had 24 fantasy points. I don't think that's something that he's going to do like a super consistent amount of time, but he has that ceiling at $4,300. That's almost 6x value for his salary. So he would be a guy that I would consider for my player pool because there's not a whole lot of value on this slate. Like I said, think about the 4 games as a whole. If you want to play the 3K misprice Larry Hughes II, and I'm not saying that's the safest play in the world, but if you want to play him, then that makes your average remaining $6,700 on DraftKings. So that gives you a little bit of flexibility, but you are probably going to want to find a little more value than just that. All right, so that does it for this 4-game Friday slate preview. So hopefully I was able to give you guys some good information that you can use to build some winning lineups. Now remember, there is always places where you can get more information from me. First off, you can follow me on Twitter at Mike's Money Picks. I will answer any start-sit questions that you have, and I tweet out any updates for the show on there as well. Also, I mentioned it earlier, if you want my thoughts for the Saturday and Sunday slates, join the Fantasy Corner Discord. It's a great community to be a part of. It's a lot of fun. We have a blast in there pretty much every day, just talking plays and then sweating it out together. If you want a community to talk about DFS with, there's not a better one out there. Join it. Link is in the description on the YouTube video and the audio feed. Also, if you want to know who from all those guys I just named actually makes my lineups, head on over to the Patreon, patreon.com/Mike's Money Picks. What I do on there is I every day post my core plays for every college basketball slate, as well as kind of my general lineup strategy and attack strategy for the slate, talking about ownership, talking about pivots, talking about games to target, not target, and so on. And so it's just a lot of information that even if you don't play everybody from the core, you can get a lot of information that can help you get better at playing college basketball DFS. And also, if you want to support me, if you want to support this channel, there's a few things that you can do. First off is like the video. It helps me out a lot. Rate and review the audio feed as well. I cannot express enough. I used to think people were just asking for favors when they did that, but it really does help. It helps the videos get noticed. It helps the podcast get noticed and come up in searches. So I really do appreciate it when you guys do like the video and rate and review the audio. Also, subscribe to the channel. So that way you can be with us for the rest of college basketball season as well as NFL and golf. We are danger close to getting 400 subscribers, and I want to hit that milestone because the goal is to get 500 before the start of the NCAA tournament, and we can only get to 500 if we first get to 400. I'm a high school math teacher. I know that math. So make sure you subscribe to the channel if you've not already. Again, that's a way that you can show me some support. If you like what we're doing here on the videos, those are some free ways that you can show me some support. You can also subscribe to the Patreon. The Patreon is how I finance a lot of the stuff that we do. A lot of the data that I give here on this show is paid for by what I receive from the Patreon. So that would help me out greatly if you guys subscribe to that as well. Obviously, you don't have to, but if you're looking for ways to show appreciation and show support, that is how you can do it. All right, so that does it for the Friday slate. I hope to be back here on the show on Sunday. The plan is on Sunday to do a golf best ball show. If you play best ball and you play fantasy golf, you're going to want to be here for that one. And then to also do the Monday college basketball slate on Sunday night as well. So make sure you come back here for that. If you're subscribed, you'll get notified and you won't miss it. All right, so like I said, hopefully I gave you guys some good information here on the show. Thank you guys for watching and listening to this point, and I will see you guys next time.